Right. So I think last week we left off. You were just about to. I think you said you were just about 18, and I think you had said that you had decided that the kind of life you'd been living since you had left home was not really fulfilling for you anymore, and you'd spent a lot of time in libraries. So perhaps we could pick up there uh, this turning point in your life.
Yes. Well, let me begin by saying it wasn't that those years after I left home were no longer fulfilling, because I can't say that they were fulfilling at all.
A bad choice of words on my part.
Yeah. But it was reaching the point where I'd had the opportunity to unravel to some degree my confusion about things, and for it to become just super abundantly clear that the life that I was currently living was a total dead end, and it was not what I had been born to do. Not that I necessarily knew anything other than the fact that I had this drive to understand and to make sense of things, that I was extremely aware that basically everybody was living in their own version of reality. And what I was in pursuit of was to understand what is the true nature of reality. And the time I spent in library and the time I spent in, well, I suppose you might call it contemplation, was certainly not meditation, but it was it was reflection, contemplation. I had pretty much exhausted the potential of that, at least in terms of the person that I was then. Of course, I didn't think of it in those terms at that time. It's just I knew that it was time to move on and that I had to. And I was so determined to that I was oblivious, truly ignorant of how nearly impossible that would be for somebody in my situation. So I just blithely charged ahead.
Where angels fear to tread, right? There's something interesting that came up there. You said, I wanted to understand, I had this deep desire to understand the nature of reality. For most people who are suffering and having a difficult time, that's not really their aim. They simply want relief. So I find it quite interesting that was what you wanted to do. Can you explain, what your sort of rationale was for yourself in that respect? If you had one.
It wasn't a rationale. It was something that had become embedded in my character when I was quite young. And this is not anything that I could have or would have said for decades. Well, although I might have spoken about these things, and I suppose somebody who is skillful might have led me into understanding this, but I'll just tell you what I mean by this. I was subject to pretty extreme physical abuse by my father. And something that he very much regretted later in life, but I had some touching moments with him in regard to that. But the situation was that typical scenario, something would set him off, he would grab a wire coat hanger, you know, the kind I'm speaking of,
Mm-hmm.
and he would crush it to become this long wire whip. And then he would whip me with that until um, I cried and he got whatever emotionally he needed to, whatever kind of release that this gave him. Uh, I can see now, I've been able to see very clearly that he was in a lot of pain and he didn't know how else to relieve that. But at some point, I became determined. Well, at some point, I developed a kind of determination and resolve that has served me very well in so many, many different ways in my life. In a sense, it's a gift that came from this childhood trauma. And I'm talking about a period of about from when I'm 3 years old to 5 years old. It's amongst my earliest memories. And just as an aside, those are memories that I have now. For most of my life, I couldn't remember any of my childhood. It was just, I guess it had been locked away. At the time, I would have said it had been wiped out, but it wasn't. But it had certainly been locked away. Anyway, what I'm referring to is that this determination, this resolve, not to give him the satisfaction of crying.
Uh-huh.
And well, somewhere along the line, I discovered a sort of dissociative state that I could go into, where I would dissociate from the sensations in my body. I pretty much had the sensation as though I was somewhere above, just watching this happen. And once I discovered how to do that, then he would whip me until he was exhausted or frustrated or whatever enough to give up. And I was able to do that from then on. But now the dissociation was something separate from the determination. The determination had led to me discovering this way of solving this one particular problem. It was that it was so important to me. Subsequently, mostly I suppose just last year or so, and reflecting on all of this, I've realized that where I was coming from in this resolve was I felt like I would lose something extremely precious if I continued to submit. And so it became like a powerful self-defense mechanism that I had to, for my own survival, resist this. But the product of it is that I recognize now that in all kinds of difficult situations throughout my life, this same resolve and determination, commitment has clicked in, and it has served me extremely well. So that's an interesting example, don't you think, of how sometimes the most what appears to be the most terrible circumstances can have as their product something that is extremely valuable. Well, so the suffering that was associated with what I had, my life had been a life of suffering. Leaving home moved me into a totally different space. There were new kinds of suffering that I experienced that were actually in some ways easier to manage than the ones that I had escaped from. So I was used to being in a state of suffering. And I was used to moving forward within that context. So I know what you're talking about. Most people in that situation, all they would be interested in is relieving their suffering. And can we speculate that that's because they knew what it would be like to be free of that kind of suffering? I didn't.
So it's almost like you're saying you wanted to understand why you were suffering the way that you were.
Why I was suffering the way I
Why
was.
is the world the way it is? Why do I have to be this way? Why do people have to, why did my parents treat me this way? Why did I have
Right.
these trouble at school? Okay, that
Yeah.
kind of makes sense to me.
Not the woeful why me,
No, not at
but
all.
rather
Just,
the why.
yeah, yeah.
Why is this happening? Why is this happening to the people around me? Why is this happening to everybody?
Yeah,
Why is this?
yeah. That makes, and you do see this a lot with spiritual seekers. But you also often see that the starting point is, as we said, that relief of suffering, and then once they're but it's not exclusively that. And what's so interesting about Buddhism is, or this kind of practice, is that uh, once you understand the nature of reality, this is the theory at least, that is actually what relieves the suffering, right?
Yeah. Well, and okay, now we put it in that context, and we could say that's a large part of what was driving me.
Yeah.
The worst suffering, of all the different forms of suffering in my life, the worst of all was not understanding why.
Not understanding
And
why.
the reason that I was so motivated to understand why was the hope that by understanding why, I would at least be relieved of that suffering. The
Yeah.
other suffering might well remain, but at least that worst suffering of all, that existential why.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Nietzsche said, it was a wonderful quote that I keep with me, and so I'm a little ashamed that I can't remember who said it, but he said, a man who has a why can manage almost anyhow.
I hadn't heard that from Nietzsche, but I
Yeah,
love it.
I hope I hadn't misquoted there, but it is something along the lines of, if you have a reason for suffering, if you've got a purpose, then you can deal with almost any kind of hardship, which I think is true.
I
Where,
agree.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I hope you don't mind that we take these little tangents once in a while, but I really want to sort of understand your story in depth. And you did
I think
say,
the point of this, is it not? To
yeah,
understand.
yeah, yeah.
This is not just a narrative of
No,
events.
no, no.
Yeah, its
And
only purpose is its deeper meaning that could be
yeah,
applicable to others.
yeah. And so back into the story though, you said you didn't realize at the time how impossible this would be for someone like you. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, it was a kind of naivety.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it was just naivety. Uh, Another thing that is a characteristic of mine, which I find a lot more difficult to explain, but it's another great gift, is I've always had a kind of optimism. You know, not that I am not capable of some degree of skepticism or cynicism, because I very definitely am. But my underlying viewpoint is always optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
But I was very naive. Remember, there's so much that other people had learned about the nature of the world that in my sequestered childhood, I had been ignorant of, oblivious to. And I suppose, in a sense, you could describe it as the unfairness of the way the world works. And so here I was, ignorant of the way the world works. determined and optimistic, and blissfully unaware of the kind of obstacles that would stand in my way. Well, I learned of those obstacles quickly enough. But at the same time, there seemed to be set in motion this miraculous chain of events that provided the breakthrough in, in the different obstacles I encountered. I mean, the best way to illustrate that is to just tell you what I did. So I heard from different people after I left home that there was such a thing as a GED exam, General Education Development, which was supposedly the equivalent of a high school diploma. Well, amongst high school dropouts on the street, this was, that was a fond belief that and so I said, why not? And so I proceeded to find out what was necessary to do that, and prepared myself for such an exam. Took the exam. I scored in the 99th percentile, and I felt confident. Well, good. Now I've overcome the obstacle of having never gone to high school. All I need to do now is to get a job and see if I can't get myself into an institution of higher learning. Well, I really lucked out in terms of getting a job. I would say this is the first of the most incredibly miraculous things that happened in this series of events. I don't know if I mentioned that in addition to the library, another place that I like to hang out was the Anatomy Museum at the University of Texas Medical Branch. I didn't mention that. Well, it was, I believe, the foremost or one of the foremost or most complete anatomy museums in the world. There may have been one that I'd heard about in Germany that was supposed to be the equivalent or maybe superior. But anyway, I loved spending time. Well, of course, it started out like so many things, a way to get out of the cold, windy rain and things like that. But I would hang out for hours in the Anatomy Museum. And just, it was so fascinating to these carefully dissected and preserved and labeled specimens and the descriptions, and just seeing the amazing intricacy of the human body that is just, it's not evident from the outside. So the Anatomy Museum was adjacent to and opened into a large area, which was a dissection lab and a dissection theater. This is where the medical students, they would be assigned cadavers, and they would do their own dissection. And the theater part was where there would be a professional dissection that they would observe before they went to their own cadavers to do what their project was for that part of the course. And of course, inevitably, in my leather jacket and ducktails and pointy shoes, I slipped into the dissection theater to watch that, and then got to know some of the medical students who were not that much older than me, 4 or 5 years older, something like that, on average. And some of them even invited me to observe their dissections. The point of this is that I had kind of established a presence there, and I wasn't aware of it, but obviously people had noticed me both in the museum and the dissection lab and everything else. Well, anyway, after I got my GED diploma, feeling so proud of myself, where would I like to have a job? Well, I'd love to have a job as some kind of lab technician. So one afternoon, I walked through the dissection lab into the corridor of the anatomy department to the door of the chairman's office, knocked on the door. The secretary asked me to come in. The chairman's name was Dr. Donald Duncan. His name was on the door. I said, I'd like to see Dr. Duncan. I mean, had I not been so naive, I probably never would have even ventured to do something as outrageous as what I did. I said, can I speak to Dr. Duncan? And she said, what's it about? I said, well, I was hoping to get a job. Joe, give me a moment. She went in and talked to him. He invited me into his office. I sat down and I said, any chance I could get a job here? I'd like to become maybe a lab technician or something, but I'd be interested in whatever you have to offer me. Well, he recognized me, and he told me that he'd seen me. He'd seen me so many times, and he'd always wondered about me, and so we chatted a little bit about different things. The amazing thing is that he didn't even ask me that many questions. I think he drew a lot of assumptions. I looked older than I was, and I was all yes sir, no sir, all of this kind of stuff. So one of the things that he jumped to the conclusion of is that I'd been in the military, that I'd probably been in the Army and was recently out or something like that, because I really did sound like, I sounded very much like that. And anyway, after we talked for a little bit, he opened up an old-fashioned ledger book, because that's the kind of thing that they had back in those days. And he said, let me have a look, opened up his book, went through it, and he said, well, I could start you as an assistant to my lab tech, but I could only pay you, I don't remember what it was, something like 126. Yeah, it was $126 this month. But he said, if it works out, next month I'll be able to increase your salary to $256. The numbers may not be exactly right, but it worked out to a round number of dollars per hour based on a standard 168-hour work month, whatever that would be. 160. I don't remember. Whatever. To me, that was incredible. So he took me into the lab. I met Ricardo. Before that, what we're still talking about, he asked me where I live. And on the way to the anatomy department that day, I had noticed there was a rooming house. There were quite a few rooming houses around the medical school. And I noticed one that had a sign that said that there was a room for rent. And I said, oh, well, I'm going to be moving to a rooming house across the street. And he said, oh, well, that's wonderful. That's perfect. So anyway, he took me into the lab. I looked around. God, it was wonderful. So amazing. All of these super things to learn, play with, and all this other stuff. And a real job. Arranged for me to come in the next morning and start. I'm feeling a little bit emotionally overwhelmed in the recollection of this, and it was an amazing experience. Anyway, once again, charging ahead out of ignorance as much as anything else. I left Dr. Duncan's office. I went over to the rooming house where I'd seen the sign, and the woman whose rooming house it was, she talked to me, showed me the room, asked how much it was, $30 a month in advance. And once again, she didn't ask me a lot of questions, which was kind of amazing. That's when I say this is miraculous. Had she vetted me in what I would expect would have been a more normal way, from what I learned subsequently, she probably would have quickly realized what I was and would not have been willing to rent a room to me. It was an interesting place. There were a number of other rooms she rented, and some of them were rented to merchant marine who, only used them periodically when they were there. A lot of the rooming houses adjacent had medical students in. This one didn't. Anyway, this was wonderful. I didn't have any money, of course, but I said, I'll be back in a while with the $30. And that's what I did. I went off and proceeded to get the money, and I moved my almost nothing.
But you said you didn't have any money. Sorry, I'm just, so where did you get the money?
Well, I had learned a lot of ways that a person could get money in those days.
Okay, all right, we'll leave it at that.
Just to be clear, I didn't go and rob somebody or anything like that. But I knew various things that I could do. This was not an unusual situation. Needing to have a few dollars here and there, and knowing all the different ways that you could do that. Yeah, so I went and I got the money, and I came back, and there I was. I had a job. I mean, all of a sudden, I had...
Amazing. So from one day to the next, your whole life just took a different turn.
Yeah, right. Well, that's an obstacle that I didn't even know that I had sailed over. My next obstacle was I learned the nature of these obstacles. I started applying to colleges and universities, all over the place, thinking that my GED diploma was going to be credential enough to be admitted. I persevered. I got so many rejection letters. I used to be able to recall the exact number of colleges and universities that I had applied to. All I can remember now is I know it was over 100. And I had amassed this number, equivalent number of letters. They would either outright reject me out of hand, or the kindest response I would get would be suggesting that if I successfully completed a year at another accredited college or university, that they would consider my application for transfer. Well, I did persevere. I did become worn down by it. I received my mail at the department office. This is an important detail here. And so Dr. Duncan he knew what I was doing. He saw all of these letters coming, and he knew what was happening. Well, this turning point, I was sitting at the lab bench. Well, no, first of all, I had gotten my mail. I was sitting at the lab bench. I opened up another letter, and it was another rejection. Dr. Duncan had walked in to the lab, and I wasn't aware that he was there, but I looked at it and I slapped it down next. I was sitting in front of a piece of lab equipment called a microtome. I slapped it down and I just, I felt crushed. And Dr. Duncan spoke up and he said, "Hey, John, do you mind if I take that?" I said, "Sure." Sure. He came back later that afternoon, and what he had done, he'd taken this letter. It was from the University of St. Thomas in Houston. The chairman of the biology department had done his Ph.D. with him. He had called him and asked him if there was anything that he could do. Apparently, he had gone first to the registrar and then to the president of the university. And the president of the university had offered the possibility that if I would come, and in the summer session, they did a couple of terms of summer session courses over it was roughly a 12-week summer and a 2 6-week summer sessions, something like that. And they wanted me to do English courses. And if I passed the English courses, then they would consider my application for admission as a regular student in September. So Dr. Duncan came in. He explained to me the offer that had been made and how it had come about. And just reflect on, I'm still in awe of how this happened. That
Absolutely, this is remarkable.
Yeah, it is. Like I say, it's nothing short of miraculous. Anyway, summer session started the next Monday.
Oh, wow. Can you believe it?
And I completed the courses. I got straight A's in all of the courses that they asked me to take in the 2 sessions. I was admitted as a regular student in September. So, yeah, a series of miracles launched me from my circumstances after I'd left home to really the beginning, I guess, of the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And, well, being in university, having all these courses available was like being a kid in a candy store for me. Mm-hmm. Because the person who had helped me to get into university was in science, and because my father was a scientist, and I had a strong predilection for science and interest in science anyway, I enrolled as a science major, and I began to take all of the science courses that I could. The other really major interest that I had was philosophy and also theology. I couldn't possibly take all the courses. Like, I wanted to take every course that was offered. So I went primarily into science. There's something else that is probably worth sharing in this. Another thing that I did in those years when I was on the street, I was, as I've already said, looking for profound answers to questions. And one obvious place, other than science and philosophy, is for finding the answers to why things are the way they are, seemed to be religion. In my naivety, the only thing I knew anything about was Christianity. And of course, what I had understood from my childhood was that uh, this was the only real religion, and the others were just, these horribly magical, distorted, pagan, blah, blah, blah. And I'd been raised as an Episcopalian, but I'd also learned that the Catholic Church uh, had continuity of existence from the very beginnings of Christianity. So once again, it's kind of similar, the same naivety. Who would, what kid on the street would do this? Well, I did. I went to the I went to they called it the Bishop's Palace. They and for the diocese, I went to the door. I knocked on the door. A housekeeper or someone like that answered, and I said that I wanted to learn about Catholicism, and so I entered into what's the word? A catechism class.
Oh, yes.
And so I attended. So one of the things that I did was I spent a few months attending catechism classes. I'd already been baptized as an Episcopalian, but I took baptism as a Catholic. And so there was this from that point on, an area of interest of mine had become the more transcendental approach to finding the answer to everything, why everything was. So I just wanted to mention that because it occurred to me, its relevance occurred to me when I was talking about going to, the courses that I took and what was available on the wonderful smorgasbord: science, philosophy, and theology.
You just wanted to cover everything, right? Every possible branch of human knowledge, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, if I couldn't find it one place, maybe I could find it another.
Maybe you could find it somewhere else, right? I would say, as the Americans say, you had some gumption, though. I'm imagining if the Pope had been living in that in that town, you would have gone and knocked on his door and said, "Hey, tell me about God."
I probably would, because in my logic, well, if you're serious about this, go to the top.
Go to the top, exactly. I love it. It's wonderful, and it obviously served you well, right? Yeah. Yeah. So when you were enrolled in the university in these different branches of knowledge, what did you want to do? What did you want to become, or was it just about I just want to learn everything about everything?
I wanted to learn everything about everything. That was primary. Yeah. I didn't have any particular goal in mind, except that, if I went into science, I wanted to go into research. If I was going to learn everything that was known, well, then I wanted to be a part of learning more about what wasn't known.
Yeah.
As an example, and I enrolled as a science student, sort of with that in mind. My father was a research scientist, and what little I knew about what happens in the world of science, I went, well, gee, why not? If you're going to go into science, go into scientific research. I wasn't interested in becoming a high school science teacher, obviously. Yeah. I wasn't interested in trade school, pre-med, pre-dent, anything like that.
Interesting. So there you are. You're enrolled in these courses, and what happens next?
Well, I learned a lot. I had a glorious time. Just to explain, in the year I spent with Dr. Duncan, I acquired an extremely valuable skill set and knowledge set. Um, he had an electron microscope laboratory, and what I learned to do was, well, first thing that I started out is he taught me, Ricardo taught me how to develop the photographic plates from the images taken using the electron microscope and to print the photographs from them. So I learned everything there was to know about black and white photography then, which was a lot in those days. I mean, things became very automated and everything else after. Then I learned to prepare the specimens for examination in an electron microscope. A lot of the work that was done in that lab was done on brain and nerve tissue specimens. So that sort of gave me an orientation that later stuck with me in life. From there, I also learned everything there was to know about the maintenance of an electron microscope. Back in those days, an electron microscope was an extremely expensive piece of very, very delicate equipment. Required its own room. The way it works is a beam of electrons, and it's striking metallic components. So it's generating a lot of X-rays. So it requires shielding. It's producing a lot of heat. It requires cooling. All of this has to happen inside in a near perfect vacuum. So there's a lot of things, very delicate things that need to be maintained and need to be working extremely well. And I learned everything there was to know about maintaining, disassembling, reassembling electron microscopes, preparing specimens for examination, right through the production of slides to be used in presentations and photographs to be incorporated into scientific research papers when they were published. When I went to university, I got a job in another university. It was Baylor University College of Medicine. Once again, in the anatomy department, strings were pulled. So I had a part-time job to help pay for my university. As a student, I worked very hard. I had little time for anything but my study and my work. And my study was extremely important to me. I did the kind of things that students often do. I got myself into a routine. This is just to illustrate how dedicated I was and how important this was to me. I'd set my alarm. I'd have an amphetamine beside my bed. I was staying in a dormitory. And I would, when the alarm went off, I'd take the amphetamine. I'd go back to sleep until the amphetamine kicked in.
Yeah.
I'd be wide awake. I'd do my classes. I'd go to work. I'd study. When it got to be that time of night where I knew about how many hours of sleep I needed to maintain this partially amphetamine-supported cycle. So I was still under the drinking age then. I was in my freshman year, I was 19. My sophomore year, I was 20, and the drinking age was 21. But as I'd been doing since I was 15, I had been going to bars. So what I would do when it was getting close to the time I needed to go to sleep, I would go to this little pub that everybody on campus went to. I'd hang out there and drink 2 or 3 beers till I was ready to go back, and I'd go to bed, and I'd go to put out my amphetamine tablet, set my alarm, and go to sleep. And I thought this was all wonderful, you know. So study, learn all kinds of wonderful things, work, be in this wonderful scientific research environment, Um, yeah, those were some of the most glorious days of my life.
Oh, wonderful. And during this time, you had no contact with your parents at this stage?
I had some very limited contact with them. I had let them know that I got into university, and my father actually agreed to provide a small amount of support for me. So
Lovely.
the tuition was not a lot, but he said if you cover all of your living expenses, and it was very much this sort of definite, well, if you think you can do this, if you think you can pass these courses, blah blah blah, then I'll pay the tuition. But you have to support yourself and pay for your books and all of that. And they did. They had by this time moved to a different state. There was a stipulation that I had to come and visit them at least for holidays.
Mm-hmm.
And well, there was a lot of tension.
Mm-hmm.
I was uncomfortable. It brought up a lot of confusion. My life apart from my family had become something very satisfying and enjoyable to myself. To enter back into that family milieu and all of the residue of my childhood, my mother's clinging, dependent attitude towards me. And I don't know, something that I hadn't mentioned is she had a total psychiatric breakdown when I left home. She spent many, many months and all of those intervening years under psychiatric care. And my brother had been sent off to a private military school. My sister had been sent off to, one of my sisters, the older one, had been sent off to another private school. My youngest sister was this rebel without a cause, reminded me a lot of myself. It was, the family atmosphere was as dysfunctional as ever, but had evolved to new forms of dysfunctionality. For me, there was a huge amount of guilt associated with what had happened to my mother as a result of my leaving, added to or mixed with all of the other things my father may have felt about me, was a very unmistakable aspect of blaming me for what had happened to her. My brother made it clear that he felt totally rejected by his family. Why else would they have sent him halfway across the country to a private military academy? Interestingly enough, it was the same school that my grandfather had graduated from in the first decade of the 20th century. Anyway. Oh, and my sister, the one who also got sent off to a private school, had started doing things like cutting herself, things like that. It was like periodically being required to go from what was for me the closest thing closest approximation to a Deva realm back into the deepest levels of the hell realms. And from there, I gradually entered into another phase of tremendous disillusionment. The more deeply immersed I became in science, there was a point there where I was thinking that I might go into physical cosmology. I probably don't need to explain what the appeal of that was. Really, it is all about ultimately understanding some of the really biggest whys that there is. But as I pursued both biology and physics, I loved chemistry. I loved chemistry. But in terms of ultimate answers, I knew chemistry was very functional and practical.
Yeah.
But physics had glorious and mysterious answers, as did biology. Well, biology was full of wonderful mysteries. How does a muscle contract? How does the heart do what it does? The brain, the nervous system. These were such incredibly mysterious things, and so wonderful. Anyway, what I discovered in my explorations in science was the limitations of science, not just how far science had come and how far there was yet to go that it hadn't. I didn't mind that there were as yet wonderful unsolved mysteries yet to be investigated. But what really came clear to me is the ultimate limits to science. What all that science would ever be able to do is really explain how the processes, once set in motion, and this was the impenetrable barrier that cosmology came closest to, but it was in cosmology that it really became obvious that there was a point beyond which that was never going to answer the questions. All science was ever going to do is explain how things worked after they had already been set in motion. It wouldn't explain why they worked the way they did.
Yeah.
Why, I became acquainted with the fundamental constants of the universe and the fact that were any of them even slightly different than the way they are, nothing would be the way it is. Huge. Well, wait a minute. I already know the consequences. The consequences are this huge, massive suffering. I want to know why it's that way.
Yeah.
And it wasn't going to answer that question. The same thing, biology. Ultimately, the same thing. It could tell me how it came to be the way it is, but not the why. So I began to gravitate more towards philosophy and, of course, religion. The university I attended was also a seminary. And so I began to think, well, maybe if I become a seminarian, maybe that's the way to go. Because I realized the limitations of science. And likewise, even in my teen years, I discovered Kant and Kierkegaard, and one of the most illuminating things was Kant's critique of pure reason and the whole phenomenology movement, Husserl and so forth. So I already had pretty strong inklings of the limitations of the sort of philosophical pursuit of wisdom. So, of course, my next best hope was religion, theology, and as I'm still, if there were answers, if religion held them, if spirituality provided answers, this is where I would find it. And I thought, how more likely am I to be exposed to the kinds of information I was seeking than as a seminarian, somebody who had committed his life to the understanding and teaching of the Christian mysteries. So I went into that. I'm starting to feel emotional. I went into that believing that as a seminarian, yeah, of course we'd have to go through all the doctrinal kind of stuff, but when we got really down to it, we'd be getting into, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, the Cloud of Unknowing, some of these incredible modern theologies that were being developed. And I did get exposed to the modern theologies, but mostly from the point of view of how heretical they were. The problem with all of the modern theologies, what made them so appealing and attractive, is they went beyond the obvious fallacy of a personal God.
Right.
But that is what made them heretical. From the time of the from the earliest days of the church, this had become embedded as something that could not be questioned and challenged, even though the very doctrine of the Trinity turned that into completely on its head. And this was the beginning of a landslide of disillusionment. And as for John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and these other things, don't waste your time. That's not important. It's not what this is about. Well, it wasn't.
That's what they told you. Don't worry about all that stuff.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
And that's what you most wanted to experience and know about. I mean, for the uninitiated, perhaps you could just explain to us what you mean by Christian mysteries, because I think perhaps a lot of people are in that position where they haven't really known that there's this sort of mystical side to Christianity. All we know growing up is the church and Bible study and catechism and priesthood as a sort of a performative job, So perhaps you could just talk about what it is that St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, Cloud of Unknowing, all those people actually had to offer you, what you thought they had to offer you.
Well, this was, of course, they were talking about exactly the kinds of answers that, I mean, they were in the right direction as far as I was concerned. Mm-hmm. This is what it was really all about. I didn't want to teach catechism classes, on to kids. I didn't want to give sermons based on rehashing the same lines from the scriptures that had been rehashed for hundreds and thousands of years. I wanted to get into the depths of these things. Christianity is full of mysticism. Mystical Christianity it has so much to offer. It's difficult to penetrate in many ways. It bears none of the sort of systemization of Buddhism and other traditions that had arisen in India, which I had yet to discover at that point. So mystical Christianity was in itself a mystery. But there are so many other Christian mysteries. There are these profound aspects of doctrine. The modern theology that I found so attractive, which was only taught as heresy, this was addressing exactly those things. 3 persons in one God, the personal God, the person of Christ, and the Holy Spirit. Now here we were really getting into something, but no, Holy Spirit, it never became more than a word. So tell me more about this Holy Spirit. Well, it's just the Holy Spirit, that's all. And so, that is yeah, what can I say?
I sense so much frustration as you're talking about this.
Yeah. Well, since I've come to see, this just segues perfectly into Advaita Vedanta, into Buddhism, into,
Yeah.
everything. I subsequently, after I discovered these, I realized that the aspect of Christianity was on exactly the same track as all of these Eastern religions and philosophies, these wisdom traditions. But the church it was not about that at all.
Yeah.
I reached a point of extreme everything. I got into this as just, I threw myself into it totally. I would get up an hour earlier every morning, and I would go to the church on campus, which had this really beautiful Stations of the Cross. And I would spend an hour doing the Stations of the Cross every morning. And, well, by the way, for some of the listeners to this interview who may not be familiar with it, a lot of the mysteries are touched on in those Stations of the Cross in a very profound way. In some ways, this could be seen as the heart of Christianity, right? It's really the what it all comes down to are the events that are designated as the Stations of the Cross. Well, I was doing this every morning. I actually got baptized again. I went through confirmation. I very diligent about always attending mass once a week and to going to confession. And, I just threw myself into it totally. And of course, the more totally you throw something into it, the more extreme and severe the dissolution. It led to my just dropping out of university altogether. This hard-won goal.
Wow. Dropping out of a university entirely, not just the seminary?
University entirely.
Wow. And can you, this is perhaps a big question, and we're running out of our time for this week, but one could understand you perhaps leaving the seminary, but could you explain sort of why you just said, well, I'm just throwing I'm throwing in the towel on all of this?
Well, if it had been if it had been an intellectual process, I probably could have said, well, okay, the seminary was not a good idea, but hey, I don't want to lose everything else that I've gained here. But I was devastated. I cannot express the totality of that devastation except to say I couldn't go to classes anymore. Mm-hmm. I'd go to class and I couldn't hear what they were saying anymore. I couldn't motivate myself to study the text. It was partly the fact that most of my courses were now church history, doctrine, theology, philosophy. Oh, one of the wonderful things that I studied was Augustine and St. Thomas. Just kind of an aside, a lot of people might not know, Thomas did pretty much the most exhaustive, analytical, intellectual examination of Christianity that anybody in history has done. And at the end of it, he said, it's all a bunch, I can't remember his words, I used to know them. He said, this is all rubbish. He said, all of this that I've spent my whole life doing. He was made a saint, Saint Thomas Aquinas. And he said, he just threw it all away. He said, everything that I've done all my life has been they're basically saying that the intellect can never penetrate into the true meaning of spirituality.
Amazing. So you were at that, following in some very well trodden footsteps, but you had now reached that sort of, it sounds like a sort of a profound existential crisis.
I had. It was a paralyzing crisis. And
I think.
Well, but there was something else that appeared on the horizon. Uh,
which we will find out about next week.
okay.
let's leave our listeners hanging. I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear, but this sounds like a good place to stop for today. So don't forget where we were. You know, something wonderful and on the horizon in the midst of all this, and it is so often that way, right? That when we are at we feel at our most deeply lost, that there is something on its way to us. We just can't see it yet. It's just over the horizon, right?
That's right.
Yeah. This has been really, really wonderful. And again, I feel like we've covered so much important and rich ground, which hopefully will be meaningful to people. And I hope you don't mind this meander down memory lane, because I know a lot of it is difficult when one takes stock and thinks back on these things.
It's very enjoyable for me because, quite honestly, the last year and a half, well, it started out with needing to reconstruct events from my life that, you know, had happened over 30 years, but most particularly those that had happened in the last 5 of those 30 years. And it set in motion the process of thinking about all of these other things that had happened in the course of my life. So in a sense, you're asking to do these interviews. It just seems like, you know, you came out of nowhere with this, but it was exactly what I was in the process of doing, learning to understand myself much better through this kind of like recollection.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether you realize it or not, but, you know, it's the unfolding of suchness that brought you and I together to have these conversations.